Today we start the population portion of ESS. This is a new new unit, and we're going to start with population dynamics. I am sick, so I will probably be coughing throughout this audio presentation, and I apologize for that. So population dynamics, we're going to be following the top four bullets, and then these two we're going to save for a different lesson, okay? In population dynamics, what we're looking at is basically different populations. So let's first define populations. So it's a group of organisms of the same species living in the same place at the same time. So for example, you have a population of wildebeest that are migrating together. You have tiger populations, which are relatively living in the same place at the same time. Now, the tiger's ecosystem, when we're talking about the same place, might be a very large place. So it's going to be a little difficult to define because it can comprise of really dispersed individuals which come together every now and then, for example, just when they mate. And populations can fluctuate a ton over time. So again, when migrating wildebeest, when wildebeest are migrating, their populations are really dense because they come together to migrate. And tiger populations, tigers are solitary creatures, and they only come together when they're mating. So the population is hard to count, and so for things that come together rarely, we tend to have a much larger area that we're talking about. So a couple of features of population. So population are constantly changing, and when we're talking about populations, we're talking about the attributes of the group, not the individuals by themselves. So these attributes can include the population size, the total number of organisms, density, how many organisms per unit area, and distribution, where do these guys live in a specific area, okay? So for example, when we're talking about the population of Siberian tigers, we're usually talking about population size because the density is so low and the distribution is so wide and varied. Other features of populations, they can give you a little bit more information because it provides information regarding whether the population's increasing or decreasing. So we can get population composition information via sex ratio, fecundity, basically how fertile they are, and age structure, the number of organisms at different ages. So these are different ways we can get more information about a population. When we're studying population dynamics, we're basically looking at how the population's changing over time, okay? So the population dynamics, here's a vocab word, is the study of changes in the size and composition of populations and the factors influencing this change. So that is population dynamics, and that's what we're going to focus on for the remainder of these notes. The key factors for population dynamics is basically their growth rate, how their population sizes change over time in that area, their birth rate, how many individuals are born in over a specific time period. So that could be over a season, over 10 years, over a year. So it depends on what makes sense for that species. And mortality, the number of individuals dying per unit area. And then finally, how many organisms are moving into or out of the population. So immigration and emigration, migration in totality. When we're looking at migration, we're looking at basically how things can move in and move out of a population, okay? So immigration and emigration. Immigration is organisms moving in to that population, and emigration is organisms moving out of that population. And it's going to essentially affect all the various factors for population. Okay, so if a population loses individuals, it could be from death or emigration. If they gain individuals, it can be from birth or immigration. We're going to do some population math down the line, and these come into play quite a bit. So for population density, we're looking at the number of individuals per unit area for terrestrial organisms or volume for aquatic organisms. So if there's low population densities, then they're spaced really far apart. Okay, so example is these molecules or Sumatran tigers. Okay, high population densities is when the things are clumped together. So these molecules basically are symbolic of high population densities. So colonial animals such as rabbits, corals, and termites exhibit high population densities. When we're talking about population distribution, it's very crude measure of population density, and it tells us nothing about how they're spaced in that habitat. And it basically describes location of individuals within an area. So the distribution patterns are looking at like basically habitat patchiness, and it tells you certain features such as like how territorial the organism is or how toxic the plants are, making it so that nothing else can live there. Eucalyptus is an example of that. They release the leaves and the kernels that they release have a toxin in it so that nothing else can live there. So again, population distribution just shows you how much of that stuff is how many of those organisms are in a given area. And they can be distributed randomly, uniformly, or in clumps. So as you can see, the termites clump up, okay? And these corals are pretty uniformly distributed throughout their, the cacti in the Sonoran Desert are pretty uniformly distributed. And so and that's basically because of the resources available. So if they're uniformly distributed, they have limited resources and they want basically to spread apart as much as it makes sense so that they can get the most amount of resources. And with termites, again, relatively limited resource, but they're all clumping together to get at that resource. Now, random distribution is when it's exactly just that. It's the distribution, the clumpedness of the organism is totally independent of any other organism. And it's not super common. And these environments tend to have certain characteristics. One is that the resources are equally available. So it doesn't matter if they're distributed uniformly or clumped, because the resource availability is going to be the same. So hence there's a probability when there's high resource availability to be random. And when there's random distribution, there's not a whole lot of interaction between the individuals. So there's not like they're competing either. If they were competing like the cactus were, then they would be more uniformly distributed. So we see this in some spiders, clams, and trees, but again, the key characteristics is like they can't be competing for resources nor space. So uniform distribution occurs where basically where there's a lot of interspecific competition. Okay, so the saguaro cactus, they highly compete for moisture, and so it's pretty uniform. Like, you want to maximize the number of your species without making it hard for members of your own species to survive. So in this situation, you end up getting like territorial versions of that organism in a homogeneous environment, meaning when the environment is the same, meaning the chances of all the organisms having the same shot at surviving, then they tend to be territorial and have like a diameter of space which they're like, this is mine. So in this example, they compete for root and crown space in the forest area, and in the saguaro cactus, they're definitely competing for root space and moisture. when we were talking about eucalyptus trees, that autotoxicity basically makes it so that you don't get two eucalyptus are spread far enough apart from one another so that there's not crowding out of its own tree. And they also make sure that no other species can live there. We get clump distribution when the organisms are clumped together, and this is the most common, and it's usually around a resource that they share, and this tends to be for social organisms, okay, and makes it so that the habitat there's habitat differences and you get some seasonal changes in weather and environment. So it makes sense that they just clump together to kind of make the most out of the resource that is available to them. It also kind of moves around reproductive patterns, okay? So if it makes sense for them to be more social, then they're gonna have the reproductive patterns kind of demonstrate that like that social nature of the organism is going to allow for at clump distribution. And so again, when there's clump distribution, because the organisms are closer to each other, they tend to have more social behavior. So now let's talk about what keeps populations in check. This slide is incredibly important. So this is a hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So populations are totally dependent on two things: density independent factors and density dependent factors, okay? So these factors are going to limit population growth. Let's start with density dependent factors because these tend to make the most sense for people. So the more of an organism, the more organisms you have in a population, the more these factors have a greater impact. So if you have a bunch of chickens in a hen house, then the food supply is going to matter. You have limited food supply. If you have disease, it's going to spread more easily because they're so clumped together. There's going to be way increased competition for food. And predation is going to impact them more as well, okay? So these are all things that are very much dependent on how much of an organism is in a population. Now, density independent factors, it doesn't matter if there's 1 or 10,000 organisms in that population, it's going to impact that population evenly. So these are basically physical factors such as rain, snow, temperature. Again, if you have 1 or if you have 10,000, it's going to impact each organism the same. And catastrophic effect. So if you have a flood, for example, or earthquake or a fire, the chances of it impacting 1 versus all 10,000 of the organisms are essentially the same. So density doesn't play a part as to how they're impacted. So if the organism has is impacted in from either causes, it's going to increase mortality, increase its ability, or increase its death rate, essentially. If it's able to reproduce, basically it can adapt to that situation and reproduce, then birth rate is increased, okay? So if it can't adapt, it dies. If it can adapt, it will make babies. And that's partially how evolution occurs. So these things the density independent factors can sometimes directly or indirectly affect the density dependent factors. So for example, if there is very little rainfall, then the food supply tends to go down. And then that affects the hens, which then will increase mortality. So when we're talking about the environmental factors, okay, we have those density dependent and density independent factors. So let's look at some other examples of this. So they can affect population sizes in different ways. So density independent factors have a controlling effect. Okay, they tend to bring down the population size and growth. And density independent factors can sometimes have an increasing effect of population growth as the density of the population increases. So humans, for example, tend to be like hens, tend to be like lemmings. We live in high density environment. A little bit more about density-dependent factors. When they're at high densities, they tend to compete for more resources and are way more easily located by disease and parasites, which makes sense, right? The more of an organism is in a population, the more easily that disease can spread. Okay, and they also therefore tend to be more vulnerable to infection and disease. So density-dependent factors that are biotic are things such as food supply, disease, parasitism, competition, predation. We're going to talk about density independent factors in just a second, but density-dependent factors tend to be biotic factors. Okay, I'm going to say that one more time. Density-dependent factors usually are biotic factors. Density-independent factors tend to be abiotic factors such as temperature, precipitation, humidity, acidity, salinity, and catastrophic events, which are also things that result in abiotic factors, such as floods, tsunamis, fires, drought, earthquake, and eruption. So both of these, this is a drought, a severe drought. Both of these tend to be abiotic factors more often than not. So when we're talking about population growth, so what allows populations to grow? It depends on the number of individuals that are added from birth and immigration, and number of individuals that are lost through death and emigration. Now, when we're talking about world population, we don't take into account immigration and emigration. Not yet, at least, maybe in your lifetime. But for now, humans aren't entering and leaving Earth. Humans are being born and humans are dying. So this is expressed as a formula, okay? And this is where that immigration and emigration stuff comes into play. So population growth is the number of births minus the number of deaths plus the number of immigration minus the number of emigration, okay? So for just all of Earth, immigration and emigration is going to be 0. So really what we're talking about is births minus deaths. For a location, okay, so a population of wildebeests in the Tanzanian plains, we would take into account immigration and emigration. So net migration is the difference between the immigration and emigration. If you have a positive net migration, that means more organisms are coming in. If you have a negative net migration, that means more organisms are going out. So when we're calculating population change, we're looking at 4 things, okay? Births, immigration, so that gives you positive numbers. Deaths and emigration, those are your negatives, okay? So addition, addition, subtraction, subtraction. Now, the rates of population change, okay? This is what ecologists usually care about the most, is how population is changing over time. And these are influenced by the environmental factors we talked about, the abiotic factors and the biotic factors, okay? So we just talked about the density-dependent biotic factors and the density-independent abiotic factors, okay? So these rates are expressed as the numbers per unit time, so for example, 2,000 live births per year, or per capita rate, the number of births per 1,000 individuals, so the number per head of population, okay? So these are 2 different ways that we show population change over time. You are probably more familiar with the per capita rate. When we're looking at populations, how long it takes for them to be a colonizing population, and then what kind of population growth curves they follow, okay? So the first time an organism kind of establishes itself, it's a colonizing population. And it can go through rapid growth, logarithmic growth, and that makes this J shape, okay? This is a J-shaped curve. And J-shaped curve have a couple of things going on with it. So population growth rarely occurs to forever at this rate, because eventually there's going to be some factor in the environment that's going to slow it down. And we're going to talk about carrying capacity in just a second, but there's going to be elements in that population that's going to make it so that it just can't grow forever. So this is the lag phase. Let's look at this curve in more detail. The lag phase is population is growing, and it's growing slowly, right? But then it's going to hit a critical point, and this is basically the point at which the doubling amount is going to be so much more that it becomes now it starts to become exponential. Okay, and it's going to sustain as long as there's no limiting factors, whether it's density independent nor density dependent factors, whether it's abiotic or biotic factors. There's no limiting factors. Once it starts to hit the limiting point, we're going to start seeing a crash. Logistic growth curve is basically now when you take carrying capacity into account, okay? So before the J curve, we just saw this first part. An S curve is when we are looking at what happens as the population hovers around carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is all the factors, the density dependent and the density independent factors that make it so that populations are limited, okay? So the biotic and abiotic factors that limit a population. And when a population is hovering around carrying capacity, it follows something called a logistic growth curve, also known as an S curve. So again, you have that same lag phase where it's growing slowly. It's going to hit a critical point where now the doubling amount is significantly more, and there's intense exponential growth going on. Once it hits in the carrying capacity, which is all the environmental resistance, okay, this is the abiotic and biotic environmental resistance factors, okay, the density independent and the density dependent factors that make it so populations just don't have enough resources to grow out of control. It's going to overshoot carrying capacity, those things that limit its growth, and then there's going to be a decline, okay? Once there's a decline and it's below carrying capacity, now there's resources available and it can grow again. And it's going to overshoot slightly and then go below. And it's going to continue to do that, and eventually it'll hover just below carrying capacity, and that's the maximum size of that population. Now, if this population had continued to go via the, going too far ahead. Here, let me go back a little bit. All right, if this population had just grown, and let's pretend carrying capacity was over here, like where the cursor is hovering, okay, and it had overshot carrying capacity by quite a bit, then it would run out of so much of its resources that its population would come crashing down. So an example of that is like bacteria in a petri dish, or Rapa Nui, right? It had taken so much of its resources, the people of Rapa Nui had taken so much of their resources that the entire population had nothing to live off of, and the population came crashing down. That is the worst case scenario for a population, and that is when it leads to extinction. We do not want that to happen to organisms nor to ourselves, right? So how can we hover just below carrying capacity? And what is our carrying capacity? We will explore those questions later. So when we're looking at some data, populations can be presented in a data table called a life table. And what a life table is shows you the years, the number alive at each age, the number of individuals surviving at the start of each age interval, and the number dying at each age interval. So it shows you the death rate, the mortality, okay? So how many individuals are dying of that age group per year. And so this is for the barnacle. And this is, by the way, this is an IA that you could do for things that reproduce pretty quickly. Okay. So you wouldn't do it in years. You would probably use some other organism like bacteria or fungus or something like that, or even duckweed. And you can figure out the mortality of that population, and it basically tells you how many organisms survive at each of that population at each year of its life. Okay, and this gives us some good information. If we see that there's a ton born and very little survive towards the end, well, then you know that it's probably an R-selected species. K-selected species tend to have these numbers much more even, and then only at the very end of life do they tend to drop off. Okay. R-selected species have a ton born, and then because there's very little parental care and so on and so forth, they tend to die off pretty quickly. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more next. So this brings into the survivorship curves, the three different ways of living, so to speak. So we have type 1, type 2, and type 3. The age structure of a population can be represented by these survivorship curves, and it's a semi-logarithmic graph of the number of individuals per 1,000 in a population against its age. Okay, so we see its age and the number of organisms. So I'll dive into each one in a little bit more detail. So because they're standardized, basically numbers per 1,000, we're looking at species with different life expectancies, and they can be compared relatively easily because, again, we're looking at it per 1,000. And it's going to show you where the highest levels of mortality occurs, okay? So type 1, we see the early loss, great high levels of mortality or death. Type 2, it's constant loss. It doesn't, like, its age doesn't matter in terms of how successful it's going to be in surviving. And then type 1 is late loss, so the K-selected species. These two tend to be the R-selected species, okay? This is like super R-selected, and this is moderately R-selected. So let's look at type 1, okay? We, by the way, are a type 1 organism. We are K-selected. So these are late loss survivorship curves, and what it shows you is because of high parental care, there's very little mortality early in life because the parental care is so high. And as they get older, just because of age, then you see the loss, okay? So it's essentially just old age that takes out these organisms. So these are K-selected species. They produce few young, and they take care of them until reproductive age, okay? So humans, elephants, and most large mammals are K-selected species, including some species of sharks, which is not a mammal, nor is it it's a fish, okay? Type 2 is those with constant survivorship curves. So age kind of doesn't make a difference, okay? They have equal chances of dying at all ages and stages of life. So these are with intermediate reproductive strategies, meaning they produce a high amount of young with medium amount of parental care. So they can die from predation and starvation equally throughout its life. So examples are most birds, some fish, some plants, lizards, and many small animals, mammals such as rodents. Okay. So again, rodents have a large amount of young. They do take some care of them, not enough care until reproductive age, just until they're, able to feed themselves. And then they're on their own. But they have equal chances of dying throughout its entire life. Now, the curves are always going to go down because eventually things are going to die when they're old. But this just tells you, like, what are the chances from juvenile versus middle age in terms of death chances, mortality chances. Survivor 3 curves are those organisms with very, very early, high numbers of loss early in life. And they have very, very, very low mortality once they get to reproductive age. And then, of course, they go down as they reach old age. But then once they hit reproductive age, their mortality levels go down significantly. So these are organisms that have like no parental care, and they make tons of offspring. They basically account for the fact that most of the offspring won't make it. And these are definitely your R-selected species. And they're most plants, most fish, and most invertebrates like insects, okay? And these guys, again, make a ton of offspring, most amphibians. Things that produce eggs tend to fall in this category except for birds. Okay, birds are type 2. They're like that middle. So when we're looking at the R-selected and K-selected species, they're basically two different ways of functioning, and they take advantage of their ecosystem in totally different ways, okay? And they evolve to adapt to their biotic potential in very different ways. So their maximum reproductive potential of an organism, that is symbolized by the letter R. So that's the most number of organisms that most number of offspring the organism can have, and that's why we call them R versus K selected. K is when the density is basically at carrying capacity. Okay, so this is why we call those organisms that tend to function near carrying capacity K selected, and those organisms that just like reproduce until they overshoot and maybe collapse are selected. So we're talking about how they live and how they take care of their offspring, basically how they live their life, okay? So let's break down the R and K selected organisms. So R selected organisms are opportunistic. They have huge number of offspring, okay? They they have high levels of competition. Their climate is variable. They're usually generalists. That what kills them is the density independent factors, not so much the density dependent. Remember, density independent factors were the abiotic factors. They tend to be type 3 or in some cases type 2. Their population sizes fluctuate wildly, often below carrying capacity, because if they overshoot, they tend to collapse. Okay, their competition isn't too great because they're such generalists. And again, characteristics about them: they have rapid development, high reproductive rates and mortality. Okay, early reproduction, meaning as soon as they're of reproductive ability, they start reproducing. They tend to be small body size, and they tend to reproduce just once a year. They also live very short lives, okay, which makes sense since they reproduce so quickly. And they tend to be super duper duper productive because they have to get everything that they need to get in life quickly since our lives are short. So algae, bacteria, rodents, most insects, and most plants fall in this category. Let's compare that with K-selected species. These guys live under much stronger competition and are pushed based on biotic factors, okay? So those density dependent factors. So that's really what's going to get them. So they tend to have much strict guidelines for their niche, okay? So they need a constant or predictable climate. They tend to be type 1, sometimes type 2 survivorship curves. Their population size tends to be constant and tends to be near carrying capacity and at equilibrium. their competition is pretty high, and they are specialists, and that's why the competition amongst the organisms of that species is so high. They develop slowly. Their body size tends to be larger. They are able to compete much more. They reproduce later in life, and they have repeated reproductions, meaning like they can have more than one set of children throughout their lives. And their lifespan tends to be significantly longer. So they're efficient because they have to work pretty hard in order to be alive. Okay. And because they have, because of these characteristics, they put a lot of energy in taking care of their young. Their offspring, they don't have that many, so they need to make sure that their offspring are really good at surviving. Whereas our selected, they have so many offspring, it's like, we can lose 90%, 10% is still a lot. My genes will still get out there if I'm R selected. Okay, so these are large mammals, birds of prey, large, long-lived plants such as redwood trees. When we're looking at age structure, we're looking at organisms at different ages, and they can be lumped into three major categories. Pre-reproductive, before they can reproduce. Reproductive, the reproductive ages, okay? And post-reproductive, when they can no longer reproduce. So the age structure of a population can help you, or one, figure out where that population's going and where the most death, at what age the most death occurs, and what ages are most reproductive. So if you're going to be working to save a population, you definitely want to limit hunting of the reproductive and the pre-reproductive years. If anything, you want to say, okay, go ahead and hunt them when they're post-reproductive. So here are some theoretical age structures. So we're going to look at possum, a large cat, and a tropical bird, okay? So if a population is stable, then the ratio of young to adult is approximately 2 to 1, okay? So aging populations are always going to go down, always going to go down. Okay, so it's always going to be some sort of a pyramid-ish shape, but if you want the population to be stable, then the young is going to be double that of the subsequent population. Okay, so over here, this is a fairly stable population. Okay, because we have, over here, let's start over here. We have a super rapidly growing population. So there's way more young than there are the next generation, the reproductive generation. So when this group is of reproductive age, there's going to be so many of them that if each one of them has 5 offspring, then now the base of this pyramid is going to be even more huge, okay? So this tends to be your type 3 and type 2 survivorship curves, like the R-ish and R-selected species. Now, these guys they're aging, but they're fairly stable. Okay, the number of next generation is about half of the previous generation. So when these guys, the 48, the youth, become of reproductive age, you still have a large population size. The population is going to be increasing. Now, when we see endangered species, one telltale sign is if the reproductive age group is larger than the pre-reproductive age. So that means that there's more adults than there are kids. So population is declining, okay? There's always going to be less elderly of that population because organisms die. That's just one of the truths. But what we're comparing is this reproductive age compared to the pre-reproductive age. When we're looking at fish, population structures can be analyzed by body size because that's related to age in a super predictable way. So if we look at 3 different graphs, I'm just going to pull all these up for you. What we're looking at is the percentage of catch and the age, okay? So where there's heavy fishing, moderate fishing versus light fishing. In heavy fishing, you're going to see that most of the fish are actually going to be small, which means that they're going to be young because they're being fished so heavily that things don't have a chance to mature. In moderate fishing, you'll see some middle-aged fish, which means that they're not being overfished so quickly that the fish can't even get a chance to be of middle age, of reproductive age. The problem is with when they're being fished, overfished, the pre-reproductive group of fish is being fished, as well as the reproductive age of fish. So there's going to be no more fish to make more fish. The moderate fishing, there are some fish that's basically allowed to survive so that they can be of reproductive age, and so that this fishery won't collapse necessarily. Where there's light fishing, you'll see a lot of bigger, older fish that are either of reproductive or post-reproductive age. And you'll see a fair amount of fish that are of the reproductive age and then a few of pre-reproductive age, okay? So it's basically the population pyramids that we just saw turned on its side, okay? I want to show you guys a case study of thatch palms. So the populations of thatch palms are, this data was taken on Lord Island, and it's an island off the coast of Australia. And what they're analyzed via the stem height as an indication of age. So we can look at the different age structure between three sites, and basically these changes are due to like how that site is managed. So over here, this is a golf course, and so there's no grazing, right? So the percentage of population is based on stem height. You have a lot of middle-sized stem and a decent amount of older stems, okay, or older plants. The far flats, you have a high amount of grazing over there. And in the gray face, this is another place where there's grazing. You can see the impacts of grazing, okay? There's going to be populations of younger organisms, but not of not as high of numbers of population of the young. Now, if you look at a golf course, why do you think there's not that many young? What do you think is happening? Think of what people want in a golf course. You guessed it, they don't want a bunch of palms sticking out. So in the golf course, they take out the juveniles, okay? We have population explosions when there is a change in the number of usually a predator or prey, okay? So the crown of thorns starfish is one of the organisms that are like literally gobbling up the corals in the Great Barrier Reef. And we've seen a huge number of them over time, okay? And so what we've seen is as a number of crown of thorns sea stars explode, the number of corals go down, okay? And once, this is very similar to the lynx and hare example that we've talked about in the past. Once the coral population has crashed, the crown of thorns have nothing to eat, so their populations go down. Once their population goes down, the coral have a chance to reproduce again, and their population goes up. So there's going to be a lag time like you've seen in the hare and the lynx. So we have these outbreaks that occur once the wow, that's a loud motorcycle. Once there's enough food for the predator, okay? So the problem is, if the crown of thorn sea star were to eat all the coral so that the corals went extinct in that area, then eventually the crown of thorn sea star would also go extinct in that area, okay? So this is something that ecologists are aware of. A lot of it is just a natural occurrence, a boom and bust cycle that happens with organisms that depend, like a crown of thorns, its food source is coral, not anything else. So when at least one organism depends almost entirely on the other, you see these boom and bust cycles. But it's something to be aware of because this is sometimes how things do go extinct. We are going to stop here, and the subsequent slides are going to be for a different day. Good night.